One of the Dalai Lama's big issues has been, why aren't we teaching in our kindergarten through 12th grades? Why aren't we teaching children skill sets like compassion and forgiveness and tolerance and, along with math and English and all of those courses? And so it's a guy by the name of Richard Moore. I've talked about him before. We won't do it today, but a guy who was shot in Ireland, in Derry, by a British soldier by the name of Charles in 1973, 72, 73, after Bloody Sunday. Was shot by a British soldier on his way to school with a rubber bullet and blinded for life. And in that environment of hate, decade after decade of hate and retribution, his mother raised him in an environment of compassion and forgiveness. And he met the British soldier 33 years later and forgave him publicly. And has an organization that he works, the Dalai Lama calls Richard his hero. It's the only one on the planet he calls his hero. So this is serious stuff. And they've been working together, and they have a program where they're training now instructors. They're going to be training thousands of instructors all over the world on how to include these kinds of topics into their discussion. And they needed a curriculum, and Life University had that curriculum. And it's called CIT, Compassion Integrity Training. As you know, one of the backlashes of a lot of the rhetoric and politics today is a lot of cities have declared themselves compassion cities. But they don't know what that means, right? Other than as a political flag that they wave. And so the city of San Antonio first contacted Life because we have a 10-part series on compassion training. And wanted their city administrators, top 100, 150 administrators, to go through the program. How many cities are now in the works?
Well, we now have 12 cities from Vancouver to Monterrey, Mexico. And I'll mention a little.
Okay, I'll let him do it. So Michael will talk about. So these are some of the things that have come out of this that go into depth as to how we deal with these this broad scope of discussion, environmental stress or emotional stresses, and what they mean in life and how they start early in life at birth, and along with subluxation, along with the environmental toxins, affect our neuroscore. There's a number of people who have been involved in that, but none more so than the person that's going to speak to you next. All of that was an introduction to my good friend and life instructor, Michael Karlin. Michael? Yeah. Yeah, he's also a sweetheart.
Exactly, yeah. Thank you. Well, before I actually click into some of the slides, I want to just say a couple things about the prison program, since he brought that up. And one thing I'd like to say first is that the average GPA of the two cohorts of students that we have in the program right now is 3.94. And they are, the first day of orientation, we were meeting with the students a couple years ago, and this is the first time I've ever had a student ever say anything like this to me. This woman looked at me straight in the face and said, I want you to look me in the eye and promise me that these courses are going to be just as hard as anything you teach anywhere else, because we don't want any charity on this. We want to make sure that we are getting everything that any other student is getting, and that means making it as hard. And I was like, you got our word. We're not giving you any charity, but they are incredibly dedicated. They are the most inspirational students to be able to teach. And Dr. Riekman mentioned the fact that this is one of the only bachelor's programs of its kind in the United States in a incarcerated setting or a carceral setting. And the way we staged it in order to make sure that if some of the students got out along the way or anything interrupted their studies, that they would have a degree. So we started it as an AA degree that will then transfer into the BA program once they complete it. And we're very, very happy to say that this December we are going to be graduating our first class of 15 AA students at Arundel University. I mean, at Life University at Arundel. So, and the last little point I'll say about that before going into what I was actually going to talk about is that because of the governor and his thinking about how to make real meaningful criminal justice reform, we made the case to him, and they accepted it, was that we needed research. We needed to be able to, as Dr. Riekman said, one of the hardest things is to be able to allow us to go in, or anyone to go into one of these settings and do research, because of the fact that prisoners are a protected population and there's all sorts of issues. And we got permission to do that, and we're already beginning. We've done 2 years worth of research already. We're going to continue the study and get ready to publish. But we already have meaningful, statistically relevant data on the difference between the students in the program and a control group of much less anxiety, much less depression. They actually sleep better. The people they consider in their social network is much wider. So we're really having a huge impact there and are making a name for Life University and ourselves throughout this whole community. And I'll talk a little bit later about some stuff we're doing with the National Conference for Higher Education in Prison. So thank you for that introduction, and that's a great program. But I'm here today actually to talk about compassionate integrity training. And let's see, do I have my slides there? Yep. And I'm very, very excited to give you the best news is in about 5 minutes, I'm going to give you permission to actually stand up, move around a little bit, make this a little bit more interactive. So compassionate integrity training, as has been mentioned, is a 10-part program that works in 3 different domains. The first domain we call self-cultivation, and this is an opportunity to work towards compassion for the self. And when we talk about compassion for the self, we don't just mean being kind to ourselves and being nice and basically letting ourselves off the hook every time maybe we do something wrong. What we mean is actually being able to go through self-transformation and to connect it to some of the earlier things that were talked about, to kind of remove some of those emotional traumas, remove some of the destructive ways that we think so that we can get to the way that we are naturally able to flourish, to recognize that we have common humanity, to recognize that we are based in compassion and that we have compassion in the core, and that a lot of the things that go on in our heads are actually destructive to us and cause us to move away from self-compassion, which then builds to compassion for others. So the very first thing is self-compassion, and that builds on a set of skills. Each one of these skills builds one from the next. So it starts, and I'm going to give you a couple of little examples along the way, starting with calming body and mind, which is kind of grounded in the nervous system. So number 1 is self-cultivation. The second is relating to others and figuring out how we ultimately build towards compassion for others, that wish to alleviate the suffering of another. And again, that builds on a set of skills that come before it. And the last thing is, how do we create compassionate systems? It's great for us to create self-compassion and compassion for those people that are in our just direct vicinity. But how do we change systems? How do we change criminal justice systems? How do we change healthcare systems in doing it in a way that is compassionate? I'll just throw out there, I know we talk a lot about how do we interact with the healthcare community in a way that's more productive. How do we make it so that chiropractic, for example, functional neurology, has a bigger seat at the table and has more impact? Well, are we better off trying to do that by creating them as the other, the enemy, the horrible people on the other side that must be destroyed? Or are we better off coming from a place of compassion, saying maybe we have something to teach them. We have a way to lift up everybody. And that's going to be a lot more effective, I would argue, because otherwise you just get into a cycle of violence, a cycle of putting people down, a cycle of trying to one-up the next person. So all 3 of these are critically important. So self-compassion, compassion for others, and compassionate systems. So what I'd like to do, the other thing I was going to mention here is that, so we work in 3 domains. We also work on 3 levels, and this ties into some things we've talked about earlier as well. The first level is what we call received knowledge. So that's what I'm doing right here. You've had a lot of that this morning. It's like frontal, here's the information that you need in order to understand what we're about to talk about. But that's a very small piece of what we do. The second piece is what we call critical insight activities, and we're going to demonstrate that in just a couple minutes. And that's where you take this information and you process it yourself. You engage with it, and you say, wow, this is actually relevant. This actually means something to me, right? You might have done that instinctively already today when somebody talked about environmental toxins or something, and you said, oh yeah, I realize I feel really bad every time I eat this, or when I do this activity, I feel horrible. And you thought, oh, okay, that's a critical insight. But the problem is that we all have those critical insights. But how long do they last? If you're like me, they don't last very long. I come to conferences, I read books, I listen to podcasts, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, my life has changed. 2 days later, I'm doing the exact same thing I was doing before I heard it, right? So this is where we connect into the brain again, which is through neuroplasticity. So we have received knowledge, critical insight, but then practice. There are practices that are contained within each one of these segments, which gives you the opportunity to practice these things on a daily basis so that you actually change the structure and function of your brain, so that you become more compassionate, not because you're just thinking about it, but because it becomes a reflex. It becomes the way you just are. It becomes embodied. So we do 3 domains and 3 levels. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of these as an example of how we do this. And to Dr. Riekman's point, this is now, we've been working on this for several years. It's all based on research that others have done around this area, and we are now beginning our own research project on this particular protocol, if you will, as a way of demonstrating not just that we can extend other people's work, but that this particular protocol has impact. And we're scaling it up internationally now. We've been doing this with prison populations, with city leaders. We're getting ready next week to launch this with 3 homeless programs in Atlanta that also work with drug addiction. We've been working with at-risk youth. Across the board, we've been launching this, and we just created a partnership with the Charter for Compassion. So what Dr. Riekman was talking about is there's this Charter for Compassion that 4,000 organizations around the world have signed on to that talk about the need to cultivate compassion, the golden rule, how we all have to come together to heal the planet. And that's really the what or the why, but they don't have a how. And so in our work with Compassion in Atlanta and Compassion at San Antonio, we just recently, because of that work, had a Compassionate Cities trial pilot of compassionate integrity training down in San Antonio, where we had leaders from Compassionate Vancouver, Compassionate Monterrey, Mexico, Tucson, 12 different cities from around the country, around the continent. And starting next week, we're actually launching a facilitator training program with them. That's the other thing, is that all of this is designed to scale, so it's not just going to be centered at life. The idea is that we have facilitator training where people go and take this out to the world. So that's all happening. So what I want to do is just focus in on first on calming body and mind, which is where we start. We start with the body. We have to start with the body because oftentimes we totally ignore the body and we're totally out of touch with the body. But the body, as we know, grounded in the nervous system, is oftentimes our early warning sign, and it's what gets out of kilter first, and it has the ability to throw us off for the rest of from any of these skills. We can't develop compassion if our bodies are out of whack. So what do I mean by that? So what we talk about is the resilient zone. So the resilient zone is this kind of zone of being where you're feeling good. You make clear decisions. You are feeling like you enjoy where you are, and it's just most people in this room right now, I would venture to guess, I would hope, are in that resilient zone. It doesn't mean that you're flat, as this line indicates. It doesn't mean that you're apathetic. We want people to have a full range of emotions. There's times when it's good to be sad. It's healthy to be sad, right? But there's a difference between being sad and being stuck in a place of depression. It's good to be fired up and excited, like I'm excited right now, I'm fired up, my autonomic nervous system is kicking in, right? But what we also want to be able to do, though, is think clearly and not be out of control. So what does it look like to be out of our resilient zone? So the first thing is, if I am going through my day and some event happens, it could be a stressful event, it could be an accident, or it could just be mental, right? I'm standing up here and I'm talking, and all of a sudden I think of, oh my God, I'm going to go to the University of Georgia football game later, and I might be late if I keep talking up here and I go on for too long, and all of a sudden now I get all out of whack. And this is what begins to happen. The best example of how you can go up and down in this was given by one of our incarcerated students at Phillips Men's Prison. Because some people say, well, you can get stuck up high, which is up here, right, where I get manic, I get angry, I'm agitated, and I can get stuck there for a prolonged period of time. You can also get stuck down low, where you're feeling lethargic, you're feeling depressed, you're feeling down, you're just out of your resilient zone, right? And as you can see, and I'll get back to the incarcerated man's story in a second, but if you look up high or you look down low, when you're in any of these states, you're not making good decisions. You're not feeling good. Your body is not in a state of like homeostasis that we've been talking about. And an example of how you can flip up and down, this guy was talking about how he was sharing an example with some of his classmates there, and he said, you know when you walk out on the compound and you see Officer Jones, I can't remember the last name, who's just a total SOB to these guys. Do you know when you see that person and all of a sudden you get jacked up and you start getting nervous and you start getting angry because you know what's coming down the pike, and all of a sudden they walk up to you and they get in your face and they tell you, you know, why is your shirt untucked, and you know, you're just a piece of garbage and things like that, right? So you get knocked up high. And then you go back to your dorm and you're sitting on your bed and you start to think, this only happens because I'm stuck here, because I made this huge mistake, and now I'm stuck in prison for the next 15 years. And all of a sudden you get depressed, right? So here he was giving a great example of how one triggering event can throw us all out of whack, throw us all out of kilter. So what we do in this skill of calming body and mind is we teach people why this happens, and then we teach them specific skills on how do you get yourself back into that resilient zone. Not only getting back into it, but eventually even being able to widen it. I think we all know people who, no matter what the external circumstances are, they just are calm, cool, collected. These are people like I want to hang out with, I want to be. And they just have an incredibly wide resilient zone. They always have the ability to stay calm and make clear decisions and be a good person. So widening the resilient zone and staying in the resilient zone. When we get knocked up high, we're hyper-aroused. When we get knocked down low, we're hypo-aroused. And there's different strategies for each one of that. I'm not going to take too much time here. And I'm not really going to take almost any time here because you guys, this is usually what we teach to people who are not chiropractors and who are not much more knowledgeable about this stuff than I am. But what we talk about is just the way, I don't know if you can see that. This is not my normal slide, so you might not be able to see that. But just basically the way our autonomic nervous system can work as both an accelerator and a brake, and how when we start to accelerate, when it's not environmentally appropriate, it can cause inflammation, it can run all sorts of adrenaline, cortisol, all sorts of things going through our body that are not healthy for us, and vice versa. If we slam on the brakes too hard and we're stuck in that place, then we're going to have all sorts of negative consequences from that. Again, it all comes back to the nervous system, and we start the whole program with the nervous system. One of the other things I'll mention, and this goes back to what Dr. Riekman was saying, is that this whole piece comes out of trauma research. And it used to be very simple to talk about trauma. We would always think of trauma as the big T trauma, the PTSD types of trauma. You know, you were involved in a violent incident. You were sexually assaulted. You were significantly emotionally assaulted. You were in war, something like that. Those are what was called big T trauma, and they've known for years that that imprints itself on the nervous system and that people react differently because of that. But over the last recent 10, 20 years, there's been a lot of research into what they call little T trauma, which are things that are not as significant, things like minor surgeries, things like dog bites, things like minor car accidents. These things, too, impact themselves on your nervous system. To this day, I can't walk out of my house without looking to see if the alarm has been turned off 3 times, because when I was 10 years old, I went downstairs when my parents weren't home, I turned on our alarm system, And when I turned around to walk back up the steps to my bedroom, I didn't realize that we had floor sensors, and the alarm went off when I hit it. Right? That's not a big T trauma, but that's a trauma that imprinted itself on my nervous system to the point where my nervous system automatically reacts without me even thinking about it, that when I open this door, is the alarm going to go off? Maybe even more significantly is what we call cumulative trauma. Cumulative trauma are things like racism, systemic kinds of issues that we deal with all the time, violence that we see third hand, right, or second hand. If we're watching the news over and over again, I don't know about some of you, but I've been glued to the TV the last couple of days dealing with this whole situation with the Supreme Court. That causes, over time, trauma to my system. And it gets imprinted on my nervous system. And everybody's different. Everybody's going to be different. Everyone's going to react different. We all have different levels of trauma. The point is that we all have it. This is not just for people who have come back from war or people who are incarcerated. This is for all of us, right? Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here and just talk about, say that's some of the received knowledge. We can understand that, maybe even make some sense of that. So what are the skills? What do we do actually to figure out how to deal with this? How do we bring ourselves back into that resilient zone? How do we widen that resilient zone? So the first skill is called tracking. I guess I got to go that way. Noticing or paying attention to what is happening inside of your body at the present moment. Now, some of us might find that to be pretty simple and pretty straightforward. But here's what I want us to do. If you will, if you're capable of standing, please stand. I invite you all to stand up. As Dr. Aikman said, you've had a lot of butt time. Now, that doesn't give you permission to talk, but a couple things. First of all, you see a lot of people. We're going to talk about the hand gestures, the movement, all that in 1 second. But without hitting anybody near you, I'd like you to smack your hands together and start rubbing as quickly as you can and as hard as you can. And then when I say stop, I want you to stop and just hold your hands out and stop. It's a big room, a lot of people, but if I can get someone to maybe shout out 2 things for me. A sensation that they're feeling in their body right now and where in their body.
Tingling.
Where? Fingers. Anyone else? Feet. What about where's the sensation? Heat. Heat in the heart. Great. Anyone else? Throbbing. Where? Hands. Vibration? Where? Hands. Okay, great. I'm going to leave you standing because we're about to do something else. But everybody who just participated did a perfect job. If you notice, the words they used were sensation words. They were not, I feel excited. I feel excited is a complex concept that we deal with up in our cerebral cortex. It's not down at our reptilian brain, which is controlling this autonomic nervous system. It's a sensation. It's throbbing. It's tingling. It's warmth. And it's specifically located to a part of our body. Most people, when you say to them, "How are you doing?" Great, sad, excited. But if you say, "Where is that in your body?" you'll be amazed at how many people cannot locate that in their body. So the first step of this skill is tracking. It's paying attention to what is happening in your body right now. And it's a skill. This is one of those skills. They talked about meditation. That comes in skill 2, which oftentimes requires you to be able to stop and be able to sit someplace. This you can do anytime. You can continue tracking right now. I'm not going to keep you standing for too long, so I want to click through. The second thing is paying attention to whether that sensation is pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant. And then the last thing is focusing on and remaining with the pleasant or neutral sensation. So why? A lot of people will say, it's good to focus on unpleasant too and just learn to live with it or identify it. You're doing this when you're out of your resilient zone. Out of your resilient zone means my autonomic nervous system thinks I am in danger. I need to fight, flight, or freeze, which is why my nervous system reacts the way it does. So what do I want to do in this situation if I want to get myself back into the resilient zone? I want to make sure my body at that very low level of reptilian brain, I'm safe. So if I focus on a pleasant bodily sensation, not an abstract thought, a bodily sensation that feels safe, within 12 seconds, the research shows, I will come back into equilibrium. So, last thing, I'm going to keep you standing because now there's two ways to combine tracking with a skill that you can use to get yourself into your resilient zone. The first is called grounding. There's also one called resourcing I'm not going to talk about. But grounding is noticing the direct contact of your body with another object. It could be the floor, could be your chair. A lot of people, when I asked you to stand up, immediately went like that, right? That is a form of grounding. This is a form of grounding. Any position that you take that makes you feel supported. We do this all the time unconsciously, right? I don't do this, but some people will hold a necklace. Some people will cross their arms. Some people will I tend to put my fingers together. But grounding is combined with tracking, where we take that physical sensation and we focus on the sensations in our body, and we focus on the pleasant or neutral. So why I've got you standing here is what I want you to do now for 2 minutes is just shift your weight around. You can move the way your hands are. You can lean against your chair. If we were doing this in a workshop with fewer people and more space, I'd have you lean against the wall. And pay attention, as you're doing it, focus on the sensations in your body and how they shift, how they might change. And if you can find, and once you settle in on one that you think where you can find a pleasant or neutral sensation, just stay with that for a second and bring your attention to that pleasant or neutral sensation. Thank you. You can sit down if you want. You can stand if you want to. So that is grounding. One of the things I personally used to do a lot of public speaking, but I used to not enjoy it so much because I would get real nervous and I would try to talk myself out of it. Oh, it's going to be fine, you're going to do great, none of that worked. Why? Because I was talking to my cerebral cortex. This first skill is grounded in the part of our brain that responds to sensations. Talking in forms of abstractions are not going to bring us into our resilient zone. Talking in forms of abstractions are just going to keep us out of that resilient zone. So the very first thing we teach people, even when trying to create self-compassion, first of all, practicing tracking will help you learn when you are activated. When am I not in my resilient zone? When am I beginning to get out of my resilient zone? And then begin to create the steps that can bring me back into it. That's the first step to self-compassion. But it's also the first step to compassion. Because if I am out of whack, if I'm not in my resilient zone, how am I going to treat anyone else? Right? So this is the first step. So thank you for participating in that. I'm going to just give you a couple more examples, and then this was our group activity. So the next one I wanted to talk about just briefly, and each one of these, again, has these practices that work towards neuroplasticity and changing who we are. The other thing is, when we talk about emotional awareness, we talk about the fact that we have beneficial mental states and we have afflictive mental states or harmful mental states. These are ways of thinking and believing and emotions that lead us either towards happiness and well-being, which is what we all want, or towards suffering, difficulties for ourselves and others, but they also distort reality. And so there are things like anger, hatred, jealousy, impatience. These things are the kinds of emotions, kinds of mental states that occur in our mind that are linked to the body, but they're the kind that are in our mind, that they distort reality, and they're kinds of these blocks to our own well-being. And we can transform them by recognizing how they distort reality. Earlier, Dr. Reekman said, if we could have compassion, integrity, forgiveness, or all that, or resentment and hatred and jealousy, which would we pick? And he said, well, it's obvious that we'd pick the one on the left. But how many times are we confronted with situations where that's not what we pick? I do it all the time. I get angry. I get jealous. I'm jealous that Ryan's Dr. Reekman's sweetheart. I mean, it's terrible. But these are choices I make all the time. And they distort reality. How do they distort reality? So, for example, anger. It's well known that when we are angry at somebody, we have what's called a refractory period. With all emotions, we have this. But with anger, if somebody does something to harm me, let's say Dr. Reekman said something that wasn't nice to me as I was walking up here. All I would think about is how he's harmed me, how he's a terrible person, how he's always done this to me, and how he does this to everyone else. I'm sure that doesn't resonate with anyone thinking about people who have harmed them in their life, right? But what do I ignore? All the benefit he's provided me, all the benefit he provides others, all the inspiration he gives to people, everything that he does well. So learning how to understand that I have good things, that positive, beneficial states of mind I have, and I have ones that are harmful and destructive. And what does that do? Learning that helps me understand that we can go from spark to forest fire very quickly. Maybe he had said something to me, and then I walk off the stage later and I go in and say, that's it, I quit, I'm out of here. Well, what's happened? That little spark has turned into a forest fire. And based on my distorting reality and my harmful mental state, I've caused myself harm. Not to mention that I've caused other people harm. But I've started with causing myself harm, which is why we talk about this in the self-cultivation. But these are skills that we can work on. These are skills practicing daily practices can help us become not so reactionary to the harmful mental states, not so reactionary to those sparks. One last, and so what that leads to in this example is what we call equanimity, right? So it's, I know I'm going to have harmful mental states, but how do I choose to not be reactionary towards them? How do I choose to embrace those harmful mental states, allow them to be there, and not respond? So that when the beneficial mental state comes along, I can choose to move in that direction. So we learn equanimity. The last thing, one quick example, last example is forgiveness. And here we learn in the program that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, even though this is in relating to others. One of the most interesting studies is that people who will forgive unconditionally, meaning they do not need someone to say that they're sorry for them to forgive them, just like Richard Moore did in the example we used earlier, they live longer. People who do not need someone to say they're sorry before they forgive them live longer than people who carry resentment and anger. So all of these kinds of emotional stressors. Oh, and so I'm not going to run into this, but basically in the program we teach strategies. So this is an example of strategies that we can use, because if forgiveness is so important, if forgiveness is something that we really know benefits us and benefits others, then we need to figure out strategies to get there. Again, and these are practices. Each one of these is a practice that we can put in place. So those are just some quick examples of the way this overall program. By the way, if you go to www.compassionateintegrity.org, or if you go to compassion.life.edu, either one of those will get you to this program. You can download the manual and audio practices for free. And then we can also talk about facilitator training and taking a course. We're offering online courses, things like that. But each one of these skills is designed to change the way we think, to eventually change our brains, and to remove a lot of these emotional toxins that we carry with us that keep us from living our full potential. So with that, thank you.